There's a player in this league who, according to multiple reports, told people in her inner circle that she believes she's worth more than an entire franchise, not just more than a contract or a trade package, but more than every player on the roster, every coach on the bench, every executive making decisions behind the scenes, literally the full organization. It's the kind of statement that instantly grabs attention because of how bold it is, but it becomes even more shocking when you place it next to what actually happened, because that same player was just traded, and not for a superstar return, not for a proven veteran, but for 2 future late first-round picks and a second-round swap. No immediate help, no guaranteed impact, just long-term assets that won't even materialize for years, and even then come with no certainty of becoming anything meaningful. And that's where the disconnect starts to feel almost unreal. On one side, you have a belief so strong it positions a single player above an entire franchise's value. On the other side, you have a front office willing to move that same player for what many around the league would quietly describe as minimal return. Late first-round picks in this league are not guaranteed contributors. In fact, most of them never develop into consistent rotation players. So when a team accepts a deal built around that kind of uncertainty, it tells you something important. This wasn't about maximizing value. This was about reaching a point where moving on became more important than what came back. Which raises the obvious question. How does a 2-time All-Star, someone with an undeniable production and one of the most recognizable profiles in the league, end up in that position? Because players with that resume don't just get moved like that without a deeper reason. And the answer isn't something simple you can point to in a single game or a single moment. It's not one bad performance or one tough stretch. What happened here was much more layered, much more gradual, and much more calculated than it looked from the outside. Because this wasn't a sudden decision made in reaction to one headline or one controversy. It was a process, a timeline that had been quietly building behind the scenes for months, with each moment adding weight to a conclusion the organization was slowly reaching internally. By the time the trade became public, the outcome had already been decided long before. The announcement wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the final step in something that had been developing out of view. And once you start to trace that timeline, once you begin to see the pattern of decisions, reactions, and documented moments that led up to this point, the entire situation starts to shift. What looks shocking on the surface begins to make a different kind of sense. Not necessarily a comfortable one, but a clear one. The moment everything shifted didn't happen on the court, and it didn't come during a losing streak or a bad stretch of games. It happened in front of microphones, with cameras rolling during what should have been a routine media availability. Instead of keeping things internal, instead of handling concerns behind closed doors like most players in that position would, she went directly to the press and made it clear that the roster around her wasn't good enough. She didn't hint at it. She didn't soften the message. She said, on the record, that the team needed better players and framed it as something non-negotiable. And in a league this small, where every word travels fast and every quote gets remembered, that kind of statement doesn't just disappear after the news cycle ends. What made it more significant wasn't just what was said, but how it was said. This wasn't frustration leaking out after a tough loss or an emotional reaction in the heat of the moment. It was calm, direct, and delivered with full awareness that it would be published and replayed. That distinction matters, because organizations can manage emotion, but public positioning is different. Once a player puts that kind of pressure on their own franchise in a public setting, it forces the front office into a corner. Now it's no longer just about internal conversations. It becomes a narrative that the entire league, the media, and the fan base are watching unfold in real time. The response from Chicago came quickly, and more importantly, it came officially. She was benched for half a game and labeled under the classification of conduct detrimental to the team. On the surface, that might sound like a standard disciplinary move, something teams do to send a message and move on. But that specific wording carries weight far beyond a single decision. Organizations don't use language like that casually, especially not for one isolated media comment. It's formal, deliberate, and often tied to documentation. It creates a record, something that can be pointed to later, something that establishes a pattern if more incidents follow. And that's the part most people missed in real time. This wasn't just about punishing a comment, it was about putting something in writing. Because teams don't take a two-time All-Star, someone they've publicly built around, and escalate to that level of language unless something deeper has already been discussed internally. That kind of move signals that the relationship isn't just strained, it's already being evaluated at a structural level. It suggests that conversations have happened behind the scenes, that concerns have been raised, and that the organization is starting to prepare for outcomes that haven't been made public yet. And once that shift happens, everything changed. The dynamic between player and franchise wasn't the same anymore. Even if things appeared normal on the surface, games being played, minutes being logged, the internal reality had shifted. Trust, once questioned in a public way, is almost impossible to fully restore in a professional environment like this. And once that shift happens, every future moment gets interpreted differently. Every comment, every interaction, every decision starts to carry extra weight. But what makes this moment even more important is what it revealed in hindsight. It wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the first time the problem became visible to everyone else. Because inside the organization, the evaluation had already started. The statement to the media didn't create the situation, it exposed it. And once it was exposed, there was no putting it back behind closed doors. The line that truly changed how people around the league viewed her wasn't crossed in a headline-grabbing argument or a viral moment. It happened in a way that to outsiders might have seemed subtle at first, but inside the WNBA, it carried serious weight. When Courtney Vandersloot went down with an injury, the expectation across the league was almost automatic. You support the veteran. You acknowledge her impact. You keep the messaging respectful, especially when you're talking about someone with that level of resume and credibility. That's not just tradition, it's part of the professional code that keeps a tight-knit league functioning smoothly. Instead, what followed reportedly caught a lot of people off guard. In a media setting, comments were made that questioned whether Vandersloot was still at the level the team needed, with implications about age and the direction the roster should take. It wasn't framed as a private concern or a developmental critique. It landed publicly, where everyone could hear it, including other players around the league who had shared locker rooms, playoff battles, and years of respect with her. And in a league where reputations aren't built overnight, that kind of moment sticks. What made it even more significant is who it involved. Vandersloot isn't just another veteran. She's someone who built her career through consistency, leadership, and championships. Players like that aren't just respected, they're protected by the culture of the league itself. So when a younger star appears to challenge that standing publicly, it doesn't just stay between two individuals, it sends a message to the rest of the league about how that player operates, how they handle hierarchy, and how they navigate respect. And that's where the real impact showed up. Not in a single reaction, but in how people quietly adjusted their perception. In a league with fewer than 300 roster spots, where players rotate through teams, national squads, and shared circles over years, reputation isn't just personal, it's professional currency. Coaches talk, players talk, front offices pay attention. One moment like that can shift how you're viewed in rooms you're not even in. And once that perception changes, it's incredibly difficult to reverse, no matter what the stat sheet says. Because production can earn you opportunities, but trust and respect determine how long those opportunities last. And what happened in that moment wasn't just about one comment, it was about stepping outside an unwritten boundary that most players understand instinctively. It introduced doubt not about talent, but about fit within a professional environment that depends heavily on cohesion and mutual respect. And once that doubt enters the equation, it doesn't just disappear, it follows you, quietly shaping how every future situation is interpreted. Which is why for many inside the league, that moment wasn't just another media quote, it was a signal that something deeper might be off. And as it turns out, that signal was only the beginning of a much larger pattern.
If the situation with Courtney Vandersloot raised eyebrows around the league, what happened next inside the locker room carried even more weight, because this time it wasn't about a veteran on the outside looking in. It was about what was happening day to day between teammates sharing the floor every single night. And at the center of that tension was her dynamic with Camila Cardoso, a player who wasn't competing for spotlight or status, but simply trying to grow into her role within the team's system. Reports began to surface suggesting that the environment inside the locker room wasn't as stable as it appeared from the outside. It's been said that Cardoso, known for her calm demeanor and steady presence, started to show visible frustration during games, moments where her energy looked different, where her engagement seemed to dip in ways that commentators and analysts quietly began to notice. Now, to be clear, no single clip or sequence tells the full story of what happens behind closed doors. But when those visible shifts start lining up with behind-the-scenes reports about tension, people inside the league start connecting the dots.
According to multiple sources, there was a growing sense that the day-to-day environment had become difficult to manage, not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way, but in the kind of subtle, constant friction that wears down a locker room over time. It wasn't just about disagreements, it was about how those disagreements were handled, how communication flowed, and how younger players especially were responding to that dynamic. When a front-court pairing is supposed to anchor your system, both on offense and defense, any disconnect between those two players becomes impossible to hide. And in this case, that disconnect reportedly reached a point where it started affecting more than just on-court chemistry. What makes this situation particularly important is the type of player Cardoso is. She wasn't brought in as a rival or a replacement. She was part of the future the organization was trying to build, a long-term piece, someone expected to develop within the system, not push against it. So when reports suggest that even that kind of player was struggling to operate comfortably within the environment, it raises a much bigger question about overall team stability. Because if your own developing core is feeling that pressure, it's no longer an isolated issue, it becomes structural. And that's exactly how front offices begin to evaluate situations like this. They're not just looking at individual moments or isolated disagreements. They're looking at patterns of interaction, at how players respond over time, and at whether the environment is sustainable moving forward. When multiple small signals start pointing in the same direction, body language, reported tension, shifts in engagement, it creates a picture that's hard to ignore, even if nothing explodes publicly. By this point, the situation had moved beyond personality differences or competitive intensity. It was starting to look like something that required ongoing management just to keep things functioning smoothly. And that kind of overhead, while invisible to fans, is one of the most expensive costs a team can carry, because the more energy a coaching staff has to spend stabilizing the locker room, the less they can invest in actually building a system that wins games. And that realization is what made this moment so critical. It wasn't loud and it wasn't officially announced, but it marked a turning point internally. Because once a team starts to feel like its own foundation isn't stable, the conversation shifts from how do we make this work to how long can we keep this together? And from there, the outcome starts becoming a lot more predictable. What made the situation even harder for the organization to ignore is that, according to reports and longtime observers, this wasn't being viewed internally as a one-off stretch of tension. It started to look like a pattern, one that had shown up in different forms at previous stops. People who followed her time at Maryland have pointed to moments of friction. Coverage from her LSU run hinted at similar challenges, even during a championship season where winning covered a lot of cracks. And now, in Chicago, with a completely different coaching staff, different teammates, and a different system, some of those same themes were being discussed again. On their own, each instance could be explained away, but when similar conversations surface across multiple environments, front offices stop treating them as isolated and start treating them as data. That's how teams think about risk,
not emotionally, not based on one headline or one disagreement, but through accumulation. When you have 3 different programs, 3 different leadership groups, and 3 different locker rooms all encountering some version of the same issue, the common thread becomes difficult to dismiss. It doesn't mean every report is perfectly accurate or that every situation played out the same way, but it does shift how decision-makers evaluate the future. Because at that point, they're no longer asking whether something happened, they're asking how likely it is to happen again. And in a league like the NBLA, where roster spots are limited and team chemistry plays an outsized role in success, that kind of projection matters more than raw production. Talent gets you in the door, but sustainability keeps you there. If a front office starts to believe that maintaining stability around a player requires constant attention, extra conversations, extra mediation, extra energy from coaches and staff, that becomes part of the equation just as much as points or rebounds. It's an invisible cost, but a very real one. What's important here is how quietly that evaluation happens. These aren't decisions that get announced in real time. They build behind the scenes through internal discussions, film sessions, feedback from coaches, and input from players who experience the environment every day. By the time anything becomes public, the internal conclusion is already formed. And when patterns are part of that conclusion, it accelerates the timeline, because patterns suggest predictability, and predictability makes decisions easier, even when they're difficult. So by the time Chicago reached the later stages of this situation, they weren't just reacting to what was happening in that moment. They were weighing it against what had reportedly happened before and what they believed was likely to happen moving forward. That's what shifted the conversation from short-term management to long-term direction. And once a team starts thinking in those terms, the question is no longer whether changes are needed, it's how soon they can be made.
The part that almost nobody wanted to say out loud, and the part that may have mattered more than anything else, was the actual basketball fit. Because for all the attention on the headlines, the quotes, and the reported tension, there was a quieter issue sitting in plain sight every single night on the court. And it had nothing to do with effort or production. It had to do with how that production translated within a modern system. There's no denying the rebounding. That's real, it's elite, and it shows up consistently. Controlling the glass at that level is a skill that wins possessions and creates second chances. But once you move past that strength, the conversation becomes more complicated. The offensive game, especially at the professional level, has clear limitations that opposing teams have learned how to navigate. The shooting range is extremely limited, which allows defenses to collapse the floor without consequence. Guards driving into the lane don't have the spacing they need. Passing angles shrink, and entire offensive sets start to feel compressed before they even develop. And that's where the concept of fit starts to matter more than raw numbers. Because it's not just about what a player can do individually, it's about how easily they plug into a system without forcing adjustments around them. In this case, it's been said that a significant portion of the scoring output comes from second effort plays, especially offensive rebounds on missed shots. While that still counts on the stat sheet, it doesn't necessarily translate into efficient, repeatable offense within a structured system. It's reactive production, not something that consistently creates clean looks for the rest of the team. For a franchise like the Chicago Sky, which has been trying to shift toward a more fluid, spacing-oriented style, that becomes a real challenge. Modern offenses rely heavily on players who can stretch the floor, operate from multiple spots, and create room for guards to attack. When one piece in that system requires constant adjustment, whether it's repositioning, altered play calls, or limiting certain actions, it starts to affect everyone else on the court. And over time, those small adjustments add up into something much bigger, a system that can't fully function the way it was designed. That's why internally this likely stopped being about whether she was productive and started becoming about whether the production was scalable. Can this style work deep into a season? Can it hold up against top-tier teams? Can it coexist with the kind of offensive identity the team is trying to build? And if the answer to those questions starts leaning toward no, then even strong individual numbers begin to lose some of their weight in the decision-making process. Because at the highest level, teams aren't just building for stats, they're building for systems that can win consistently. And if a player, no matter how talented, forces those systems into constant compromise, the long-term outlook becomes harder to justify. That's the part that rarely gets discussed publicly, because it's not as dramatic as a headline or a controversy. But inside a front office, it can be the most decisive factor of all. And then there's the factor that quietly changed the equation for everyone, not just one team, not just one player, but the entire league. Because while all of this was unfolding internally, the standard for what elite basketball looks like was being reset in real time by Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever. This wasn't just about one star putting up big numbers, it was about a completely different offensive identity taking shape, one built on spacing, speed, decision-making, and constant pressure on defenses from every area of the floor. Clark's impact goes beyond scoring. She forces defensive systems to stretch in ways they weren't designed to handle consistently. The moment she crosses half court, defenders are already making decisions. Do you pick her up early and risk opening space behind you, or do you drop back and give her room to create? And once that first decision is made, everything else starts cascading. Shooters get cleaner looks, cutters find open lanes, and bigs operating inside suddenly have more space to work with. It's not just an offense, it's a chain reaction. And that's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because the kind of offense Indiana is running doesn't just reward talent, it demands specific types of players to function at its highest level. Floor spacing isn't optional, quick reads aren't optional. The ability to operate away from the basket, to stretch defenses, to keep the flow moving without forcing resets, those are baseline requirements. Teams that can't match that style don't just fall behind slightly, they get pulled into matchups where every weakness is exposed possession after possession. When you place that reality next to the roster construction questions Chicago was dealing with, the pressure becomes clear. It's no longer enough to have productive players, you need pieces that fit into a system capable of keeping up with that level of offensive pressure. And when a player's skill set naturally compresses the floor instead of expanding it, it creates a direct conflict with where the league is heading. It's not about effort or even talent, it's about alignment with the direction the game is moving.
And in isolation, maybe you can work around that. Teams adjust, coaches scheme, lineup shift. But the problem becomes much more serious when you look at who Atlanta has to compete with, especially in the Eastern Conference, because across from them is a system like the one run by the Indiana Fever, led by Caitlin Clark, where spacing isn't just a feature, it's the foundation of everything they do. That offense forces defenders to cover the entire floor, from deep perimeter shots to quick interior actions, often within the same possession. If your roster can't match that flexibility, you don't just struggle, you get put into impossible defensive situations over and over again. And that's where this trade starts to look risky, because adding a player who doesn't naturally extend the floor means Atlanta could find itself constantly adjusting instead of dictating. It's the same issue Chicago was dealing with, having to build around limitations rather than maximizing strengths. And in today's game, especially against teams built like Indiana, that approach doesn't hold up over time. Every possession becomes harder, every defensive stop requires more effort, and over the course of a full season, that kind of imbalance adds up. There's also the gap between visibility and impact, which can sometimes get overlooked in moments like this. Moves like this bring attention, jersey sales rise, social media engagement spikes, and the buzz around the team grows. But none of that translates directly to wins. Popularity doesn't defend a pick and roll, it doesn't close out on shooters, it doesn't fix spacing issues in the half court. And if those basketball problems remain unsolved, the early excitement can fade quickly once the reality of on-court performance sets in. That's what makes this such a high variance move. If everything clicks, if adjustments are made, if roles are clearly defined, if the system evolves, there's a path where it works. But if those underlying fit issues stay unresolved, Atlanta risks inheriting the same challenges that pushed Chicago to move on in the first place. And in a league where the margin for error is getting smaller by the season, taking on that kind of uncertainty is a gamble that doesn't always pay off. Which is why this isn't just about what Chicago gave up, it's about what Atlanta is now responsible for managing. Because the same questions that led to this trade didn't disappear, they just changed locations. And the moment those questions start showing up again on the court, this move will be judged very differently. What makes this entire situation so significant isn't just the trade itself, it's what the trade represents. Because this isn't only about one player, one locker room, or one front office decision. It's about a shift that's happening across the entire league, whether teams are ready for it or not. The standard has changed. What used to be manageable, on-court limitations, personality friction, system adjustments, is now being evaluated under a completely different lens, and that lens is far less forgiving. At the center of that shift is the new model of winning basketball, led by players like Caitlin Clark and teams like the Indiana Fever, where spacing, pace, and decision-making aren't luxuries, they're requirements. It's no longer enough to have talent. It's no longer enough to produce individually. Everything has to connect. Every piece on the floor has to enhance the system rather than force it to adjust. And when one team proves that model works at a high level, every other team is forced to measure themselves against it. That's why decisions like this are happening now and why they're happening faster. Front offices are no longer just asking who their best players are, they're asking who fits the direction the league is going, who scales with the system, who adds flexibility instead of removing it, and just as importantly, who contributes to a stable environment that doesn't require constant management behind the scenes. Because in a league this competitive, even small inefficiencies get exposed quickly. And that's the real takeaway here. The gap between teams that adapt and teams that don't is getting wider. Some organizations are building with that future in mind, prioritizing fit, cohesion, and scalability. Others are still trying to make older models work, adjusting on the fly, reacting instead of anticipating. And when those two approaches meet on the court, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. So this isn't just the end of one chapter, it's a signal that the league is evolving, that expectations are rising, and that every decision moving forward will be judged against a new standard. The only question now is which teams are going to adjust fast enough to keep up, and which ones are going to realize too late that the game has already moved on.
Their on-court matchups only made that gap more visible. Every time these teams shared the floor, the difference in structure stood out. Indiana's offense created layers, multiple options unfolding at once, while Chicago often had to work harder for cleaner looks. And over time, those differences don't just show up in highlights, they shape how teams evaluate themselves. Because when you're trying to build something sustainable, you're not just asking, are we good? You're asking, are we built to compete with that? And that question has become unavoidable in what many are starting to call the new era of the league. The Clark effect isn't just about popularity or viewership, it's about raising the baseline for what winning basketball requires. It forces every front office to look at their roster and decide whether it can operate in that environment without constant adjustment. And if the answer is no, then change stops being optional. That's what makes this part of the story so important, because while everything else, the quotes, the tension, the reported issues helped shape the decision, this is what defined it. The league is evolving, and the margin for inefficiency is shrinking fast. And when that shift happens, players who don't naturally fit into that evolution don't just face criticism, they face difficult decisions from the organizations trying to keep up. By the time everything reached its final stage, the situation wasn't hanging on one last mistake or one dramatic incident. It was already leaning in a direction that felt inevitable. But there were still moments that, according to reports, removed any remaining doubt inside the organization.
One of those came late in the season, when a stretch of missed games was officially tied to a back issue. On the surface, that explanation made sense. Injuries are part of the game, and teams deal with them constantly. But the timing of those absences, as some observers pointed out, appeared to overlap with a period when internal accountability conversations were reportedly becoming more direct and more difficult behind closed doors. Now, to be clear, injuries and recovery timelines are complex, and no single moment tells the full story. But when footage began circulating that showed her traveling and moving freely in a way that, at least visually, didn't seem to match the limitations usually associated with that kind of injury, it raised questions. Not definitive conclusions, but questions. And in a situation where trust had already been tested in multiple areas, even the appearance of inconsistency can carry significant weight internally. Because at that point, organizations aren't just evaluating actions, they're evaluating reliability, communication, and alignment. And that's what made this moment so critical. It wasn't necessarily about proving anything one way or the other. It was about how it was perceived. Front offices operate on clarity, and when clarity starts to fade, decisions accelerate. What might have been manageable earlier in the process becomes much harder to justify, layered on top of everything that had already happened. The margin for uncertainty shrinks, and patience goes with it. Then came the public side of the story. When the trade was finally announced, the immediate reaction on social media painted a completely different picture. Energy, excitement, a fresh start. But behind that, reports suggested a much more intense private response, with frustration not just about being traded, but about how the situation had been framed publicly. The conduct detrimental label, the timing of the leaks, the narratives circulating alongside the deal, it all created a sense, at least from her perspective, that the organization was controlling the story in a way that reflected poorly on her. And that's where the now widely discussed quote enters the picture. It's been said that she told people close to her that she's worth more than the entire franchise that moved her. Again, that's not something confirmed in an official statement. It's part of the broader conversation that's been circulating around this situation. But whether taken literally or as an expression of frustration, it highlights just how far apart the two sides had become in how they viewed the relationship. On one side, a player who believed in her value at the highest possible level. On the other, a franchise that had already decided the cost of continuing forward outweighed the benefits. And once you reach that point, there's really only one outcome left. Because this wasn't a negotiation that broke down at the last minute. It was a separation that had been building quietly, step by step, until there was nothing left to repair. The trade didn't create that reality, it simply made it official. The assumption after a move like this is usually simple. One team cuts its losses, the other takes a chance. But this situation isn't that clean, and it's not that one-sided. Because while Chicago may have reached a point where moving on felt necessary, that doesn't automatically mean the situation improves for the team on the other end of the deal. In fact, there's a very real argument that this trade could create a completely different set of problems for the Atlanta Dream. Problems that don't show up in headlines, but show up quickly once games start being played. The biggest concern comes down to fit, and not in a vague, abstract way, in a very specific, on-court sense. Atlanta's front court had structural questions before this move, especially with Brittney Griner anchoring the interior. Griner still brings size, presence, and undeniable impact near the basket, but her game at this stage is naturally more traditional. She operates inside, protects the paint, and doesn't stretch defenses out to the perimeter on a consistent basis. When you add another front court player with a similar lack of spacing, you're not solving a problem, you're doubling it. Suddenly, the floor shrinks, driving lanes get tighter. Defensive rotations become easier for opponents because they don't have to respect multiple shooting threats from the big positions.